Hey, I got the story of your King Bradley. So it all happened a long time ago, 60 plus years ago, in the Full Metal universe. He was born, taken from his family at a very young age. Never knew who his real parents were. Hell, he didn't even have a name yet. This boy was put through, rigorous training, you know, learning about, history, politics, swordsmanship, gunmanship, martial arts, the whole 9 yards, right? Eventually, they got to the point where they were trying to find the king of the country, the Führer of the country, Amethyst, who would lead Amethyst into the future. Um, they had all these able candidates, or these people who were great prospects, the greatest soldiers that they could produce. You know, out of 12, they all died. There was 12 of them that died before. All right, then this guy stepped forward, and the Philosopher's Stone rooted inside of him, and he became known as Wrath. He became the wrath of the dwarf in the flask. We call him Father, right? He became a homunculus, born a human, and then became a homunculus, and he became very wrathful, right? That's basically what he was created to be, and he did that very well, because then he started the war against the Ishbalans, right? At some point in his career, he did that. you know Younger Mustang, and you know Rize, and Armstrong, and Kinley, and all of them stormed Ishbal, and took those people down. They believed that they were taking down the enemy for their country, because that's what Fear Bradley wanted them to do. You'll kill these people, and even bring some of them, take some of them prisoner. Taking these people prisoners, they were going to use these innocent people's lives to create philosopher's stones, right? Because that's how they're created, from sacrificing other people's lives to gain, you know, a philosopher's stone. And certain philosopher's stones were used to amplify other alchemists, alchemy, like Kimberly. He went in and destroyed, villages, right? Um, but Bradley also got to the point where he um, made Edward and Alphonse, state alchemists. Mostly Edward, though. He made him the state alchemist, and his brother was just, along for the ride. He basically had the status of a major, because of how well versed he was in alchemy. You know, and he was working with the military because of Fear Bradley. Fear Bradley did that, but Fear Bradley also knew what his real intentions were with that. That he was going to be one of the sacrifices in the promised day. As they were getting closer to the promised day, one of his um, brethren, as a homunculus, greed started to become more greedier. So he was actually trying to get away from his father and do his own thing. But he, put an end to that shit real quick. And then a new greed was formed. And then, King Bradley had the audacity to be like, how is it? How you doing, Greed? You doing all right? You doing good, pal? That's good. It's really good that you're doing all right. Because, he's the one who put him in the fucking ground, or caused him to have to be reborn as a new Greed. Memories wiped away and everything else. But that would come to a head, eventually, it would. If you were King Bradley, then um, he called Mustang in, And he was like, yes, you are surrounded by um, other people who know about me. All the higher ups know about me being a homunculus. All the higher ups in Central understand that. So it's like, you know, you're telling people shit that, you know, they already know and shit you shouldn't know as your lower rank. But now that you do know, I'm sending, you know, all the people you work with, all your underlings, they're going to other, you know, parts of Amestris. They're going to the east, they're going to the west, they're going to other bases, right? And you're not going to tell anybody shit about, you know, this. You know, you'll drop this and, you know, nobody will, you know a thing about me being a homunculus or, you know, there's no you trying to take over or anything like that. Eventually, though, he did get on the train to go to Drachma. I think that's where he was heading. Boom, the train got. Oh shit! This man, the way this guy moves, you gotta watch FMAB, Full Metal Alchemist: The Brotherhood. Boom, the train, you know, was destroyed. He, you know, managed to survive that incident. He comes back to his, you know, he goes back to Central, and the place is overtaken by Drachma soldiers, you know, because they know that Fuhrer Bradley's a homunculus, and they didn't, you know, they don't like that shit. They're trying to sacrifice people for a grand, you know, transmutation. You know, they don't even know all the details yet, but he's, you know, basically evil. He plans to sacrifice his own people for this. You know, they found this out. He ran right through. He caused the fucking tank to retreat. Yes, I'm talking about a tank that's supposed to like move forward and take damage. Forced one of those things into retreat mode, and he went in there and cut, you know, people down. He had to fight against. He fought against a Briggs commander, cut his arm off, and his arm's not. It ain't just a regular arm. It's like one of these, you know, saws. But it's a saw that can also like chomp down, and he just cut that shit off like with ease. He had no fucking issues with that. Um, you know, like showing like real experience and shit, right? And then another old man showed up, and his name was Fu. Fu, you know, came in swiftly, you know, but he left just as quick. You know, he was there. And then Greed started to remember. He was like, oh my God, you bastard. You're the reason I fucking died and I had to come back again. You know, so he wanted that fucking get back. You know, Fuhrer Bradley escaped that incident, you know, into the sewers, and he showed up to put Roy Mustang in a transmutation circle, so that he could be or teleported to, you know, Father to become a sacrifice, for, you know, turning him into, you know, basically a god, you know. His last fight on the promised day was against Scar, you know. It was fair, you know, if you really think about it, because it was Fuhrer Bradley who, you know, wanted to, you know, go to war against Ishbal. Ishbal didn't, you know, they were not, you know, heathens like that. They were not people who just ran around and um, massacred other peoples or even like fought amongst themselves in that manner. They were actually very, you know, peaceable people. But then he went in there and, you know, fucked with them, you know, sacrificed them to create philosopher's stones. You know, Scar lost his brother in that encounter, but then he was able to defeat Fuhrer Bradley. Fuhrer Bradley, you know, made that a really close fight, though. It was really tough. But when he died, he aged real quick, you know, and he died with no arms. Not even really giving a fuck that he was human to begin with, you know, not really, you know, just the fact that he, you know, could be king for as long as he was, you know, and fulfill that role. That's all he cared about at the end of it. You know, he didn't even give a fuck that he had a wife and a son, and, you know, all that shit was basically, you know, fabricated and other things. You know, he didn't care about that. You know, he just was glad that he fulfilled his role as, the figurehead of Metris, and then he died. But that's the story of, Fjord Bradley, that's told by Darius the Green Angel. But you guys gotta watch Full Metal Alchemist: The Brotherhood. It's a really good anime. You can probably find that on, your Netflix, your Hulu, your Crunchyroll. And they got that in dub too. It's on like Netflix, Hulu. I don't know if Crunchyroll has it in dub, but find it, watch it. It's only 64 episodes. That's light work for somebody like who watches anime. But be cool, Call on the Corner, y'all, and let me know what you think about him in the comments.